Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum. Thank you. It's truly an honor to serve. Along with Stephen Rothstein, who is Director of the John F. Kennedy Foundation, and all of our foundation and library colleagues, I welcome you to this evening's forum on religion and politics in America. We also welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. I wish to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsor Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. Periodically throughout this evening's conversation, you will notice our team passing through the hall with cards and pencils to collect your questions. We are pleased to have the opportunity to consider tonight's topic, especially in light of the issues and concerns John F. Kennedy's religion played in his 1960 run for the presidency. I'm now delighted to introduce tonight's panelist. E.J. Dionne is a distinguished journalist and author, political commentator, and longtime op-ed columnist for the Washington Post. He is currently a visiting professor at Harvard Divinity School and is also a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, a government professor at Georgetown University, and a frequent commentator on politics for National Public Radio, ABC's This Week, and MSNBC. I'm also pleased to welcome our moderator for this conversation, Margery Eagan. She is the co-host of 89.7 WGBH's midday program, Boston Public Radio. Her column appears regularly in the Boston Globe, and she was the Catholic spirituality columnist for the Boston Globe's website, Crux Now. In 2015, she won first place for excellence in religion commentary at the Religion News Writers Association annual conference in Philadelphia. Please join me in welcoming our special guest this evening.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. There's two more things we should mention here. Number one, EJ and I come from the same hometown.
Fall River, Massachusetts.
That's right.
We love to torture. I've had the great joy of being on the show a number of times, and we love to torture Jim by beginning with a long riff about Fall River.
That's right. That's right. And the second thing is that Alan did not mention, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Front Runner. It's in theaters right now, the story of Gary Hart's presidency. Some of you may not know that not only is not actually EJ a composite of EJ that's has a starring role in this movie, but just tell people who may not know before we get to religion and politics about your role in the Gary Hart demise back in 1988.
Let me just say a couple of things first. To paraphrase a famous president, I have the highest honor tonight. I am the man who accompanied Margery Eagan to the Kennedy Library.
EJ.
So I am
EJ.
I am very proud and happy of that, and I am a huge fan of their show. And I do want to honor my sister Lucy and Dionne Thomas and her husband Drew. If there is anyone who's a bigger fan of yours than I am, it's my sister. And also two dear Fall River friends, Bill and Debbie Kennedy. We were involved in many political adventures together, not all of them successful, but they were all fun. But a fair few times we did it. But I want to say, we've got to check this historically. Alan may be the first director of this place who actually won an election. That you don't know that Alan was elected to the school committee in Cambridge in 2000. I think it's really good to have somebody running a presidential library who actually knew how to win an election. So we salute you for that. So I'm the guy Gary Hart said, "Follow me around" to, and I didn't. It was a matter of great what do I want to say? Joy and curiosity when my wife saw the article in the New York Times and was reading along one morning at breakfast and discovered there was a character in the movie loosely modeled or after me, and my name was there in this story, and she sent it around to the kids. And at least the story suggests that the character is the sort of moral troubled character in the movie.
That's right.
And so one of my daughters said, "God, Dad, I'm glad you're the moral guy in this movie." But it's a long story, but to make a long story short, I was writing a profile of Gary Hart for the New York Times Magazine in 1987. And I did 2 long interviews with Hart. And if you want to see a political reporter made fun of brilliantly, read Richard Ben Kramer's book, What It Takes. There were 3 pages about my interview with Gary Hart, including in the Howard, the scene is in the Howard Johnson's in Manchester, New Hampshire, and he correctly says that I had this big pile of papers on the Howard Johnson's table and proceeded to knock them all on the floor of the Howard Johnsons as I was interviewing Gary Hart. And if you remember, there were starting to be rumors about Gary Hart's personal life, and other campaigns were saying this and that. And I didn't want the piece to be about his sex life. I have always been uneasy about this whole issue in public life, because my basic theory is that for every one person outed on this, there are 10 or 20 or 30 whom we never talk about this. And there's something very odd about how sexuality becomes an issue for some candidates and not for others. Although now we're in a whole different place on this as a country, in a number of ways, actually. But I felt that the profile wouldn't be appropriate, that there'd be something wrong if I completely ducked the issue. And so I asked him the question, and he said what he said. I should have that whole quote seared in my mind, but it was, follow me around, you'll be very bored. He was basically saying that was over. And I remember to this day, this was the second interview on a plane. I think we were flying to Texas or Denver. And, a part of me thought, a lot of his friends had said, this was okay before, it's not okay anymore, you got to be careful now. And I thought, okay, he's decided to clean up his act. And then started running through my head, how will this quote be used? And then it turned out that the Miami Herald got a tip about a woman who was visiting his apartment. They staked out the apartment. It was very controversial at the time. And the New York Times Magazine came out the same Sunday as the story of their stakeout of Hart. But the New York Times Magazine is printed on Wednesdays. And so they had gotten hold of that. And so the kicker, the last sentence of their stakeout story was the quote to me in the magazine. And the way I found out about this story, news didn't travel as fast in 1987, is my friend Bill Schneider, whom many of you, my former professor, who worked for CNN for many years. He was a great political analyst. And typical of the vain writer, I'm sitting on my deck rereading my magazine piece, I don't know, for the 2nd or 3rd or 4th time, and my phone rings, and I pick it up, and it's Bill, and he says, and Bill is very energetic, and he says, EJ, great piece on Gary Hart. You know your line about follow him around? Well, somebody did. And then the whole story took off, and I truly hated that week. I haven't seen the movie yet.
It's gotten
but
good reviews.
apparently but I sort of worried about the turn we were taking, and yet, as the whole story unraveled, I think a lot of people have had 2nd, 3rd, and 4th thoughts about all this kind of thing, both with Trump and with the Me Too movement, raising a lot of legitimate questions about the role of sexuality in public figures. And so I'm anxious to see the movie, although I don't know. I'm not worried about how my character is portrayed. I'm just not sure I want to relive that week, because it was a really strange week in our politics. Because Hart was a brilliant and gifted person. And by the way, he did see 9/11 coming before. I had him actually with the late Senator Warren Rudman to a lunch at Brookings about 6 months or a year before 9/11. And they actually laid out the danger of terrorism in quite precise terms. So he was a very gifted person. But I think one of his mistakes was not to realize that something had turned in American politics, and what was permissible in the past and what reporters didn't report on in the past, that was about to change. And he got caught in that transition and didn't realize he was in that transitional moment.
Well, you know, before we get to the religion and politics part, I've often thought about this incident of men, politicians fooling around, that maybe we want to discount that, as long as we're going to discount the women politicians who may be fooling around, and I'm not sure that we would do that for 2 seconds. I can't imagine we might feel the same way about Hillary Clinton's carrying on as you might feel about a lot of the men politicians.
Well,
So
in fact, at the time of the Hart thing, there really was a division among male and female reporters, and that there were, I think, female reporters who felt that men had gotten a pass on this stuff for too long, even back then. And you did see these arguments break out.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had like second, third, and fourth thoughts about this stuff for 30 years.
wasn't that what Maureen Dowders argued in the New York Times, that what changed for a lot of these men politicians was more and more women reporters?
Right.
And that
No, and it did make a difference.
Yeah.
There was I participated in a little documentary on Hart, and the producer and I were talking about it, and he talked about how the perspectives on all of this are quite different from women, and that was an important piece of what happened then.
So I just want to tell you what we're going to do. We'll probably spend about 50 minutes talking between ourselves. Then we'll leave a good half hour for questions. I thought we'd start with the course that you're teaching over at Harvard this semester, because I think it's got a great, it's very provocative. A lot of the things you've talked about in that course. Then talk a little bit about a great piece you wrote about being a Catholic in these difficult times for the Catholic Church, and then maybe do a few little political predictions before we go to questions, if that's okay. So
I'm usually wrong, just to warn you.
So EJ,
Bill Kenny will be mayor of Fall River soon. As
long as you're mentioning your friends in the audience, my sister is here in the front row, and I think one of my sister's claim to fame that's apropos for the Kennedy Library is that being good Irish Catholics, my sister's entire room as a child was festooned with every single solitary poster you could imagine of Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, and I think she's read every single solitary book that's been ever written about any of the Kennedys or the Shrivers or the Radswells. Or I think she's got it all wrapped up.
In Fall River, the turnout slogan was, "Vote for the Kennedy of your choice, but vote." You know.
So anyway, tell us, what is the name of the course that you're teaching at Harvard, and what have we learned, or what have you learned teaching this course?
Well, the course is called Religion in America's Political Conscience and at the Ballot Box. And as I told my students on the first day, I seem to have separated the ballot box from the conscience. It's fairly far down in the title. And I've taught courses on religion and politics for some time. I teach a course kind of like it at Georgetown as well. And the theory behind the course is that separation of church and state is different from the separation of religion and politics, because religion has always been intertwined in politics in one way or another, and that I think in recent years, since the 80s, we've gotten the idea that somehow when religion is involved in politics, it's only on the conservative side of politics, which, among other things, forgets the civil rights movement and the role of the African American church. In fact, just by chance, maybe the Holy Spirit, my playlist played an old Simon and Garfunkel song. I will date myself. The church is burning. And it's a song about the burning of churches, of African American churches in the South. And there's a line in the song about the fire rising as hands that are praying. And the last line, the refrain, is, "You can burn down my churches, but I shall be free." And these were churches committed to civil rights, and they were being burned by racists because the church was the center of one of the centers of social life and activism in the African American community. And you can go down a long list. The abolitionists were religiously inspired. The labor movement had a very strong Christian, and in many places, certainly here in Massachusetts, Catholic base. Jews have been central to every fight for social justice in our history, particularly when you think of the people killed in the civil rights here. The white people killed, many of them were Jews, Werner Goodman and Cheney, Schwerner Goodman and Cheney. And so that's sort of, to begin with, religion is involved on all sides of politics, and obviously we see around the world religious engagement. And what I do in the course is talk about groups and how historically Catholics and the African American church and white evangelicals and mainline Protestants, Jews, and Muslims have been involved in politics over our history. We talk about prejudice. And incidentally, when you think about how racialized we can get, there's a wonderful professor at the Divinity School called Catherine Breckis. You should have her on your show if I could lobby. She's brilliant. And she she came in and gave a lecture on Catholicism and the history of anti-Catholicism. And she showed a cartoon from Thomas Nast from, I think, the 1870s and 1880s. And the Irish were made to look black in some of the anti-Catholic newspapers. There was the white person, the Anglo-Saxon person, the African-American, and the Irish person was made to look black. We have racialized immigration at every stage. And right now, you sit here in Boston and you say they made the Irish into African-Americans, but they did. And they did that with the Italians, they did that with Poles and Jews and others who came to our shores. But then we also look at great thinkers who have linked politics and religion. I did a class on Martin Luther King with this wonderful 92-year-old professor at the Divinity School called Preston Williams, who's one of the great interpreters of Martin Luther King's religious and social thought. We did a class on Abraham Heschel, with a great rabbi and scholar who wrote about the prophets and was actually at King's side. And I had the great good fortune, a friend once said of me that I'm the only person he ever met who'd go 2,000 miles out of his way just to impose. And so I have imposed on all my friends to come and talk to my students. And Susanna Heschel, Abraham Heschel's daughter, who's a great professor up at Dartmouth, came and talked about her father's thinking and his attitude toward the prophets. So that's an outline. And then we do particular issues at stake. And obviously we look at the electoral connection as well. Reinhold Niebuhr is one of my heroes. I also did a class on Niebuhr. A great Niebuhrism that we talked about today, actually thinking about the election, which none of us lives up to, but that I've always loved, is we must seek the truth in our opponent's error and the error in our own truth. We're doing a whole lot of that in politics right now, aren't we?
No.
But it's a really interesting discipline that that's a hard discipline, but it's a good idea.
Well, you know what I'd love to get your take on is there's been this, going back to 2016, a kind of an odd schism among white evangelicals. And Jim Wallace, Sojourners Magazine, has been very critical of other evangelicals in supporting policies that don't seem particularly Christian, like attacks on immigration, like supporting tax cuts for wealthy people. Talk a little bit about the role of the white evangelicals, different from black evangelicals in voting patterns certainly, but the white evangelicals in the election of Donald Trump.
Right. The evangelicals, in a way, white evangelicals, in a way, or maybe are more of a conundrum than they should be to us. And I'll explain that in a second, but it is true that there are many committed white evangelicals who have been very critical of Trump. Russell Moore, the head of the Southern Baptists political sort of public life committee, has been very critical of Trump. My colleague at the Washington Post, Michael Gerson, who worked for President Bush, he wrote a very powerful piece in The Atlantic a few months ago. Pete Wainers, another conservative. I mean, there are a lot of conservative evangelicals, not just progressives like Jim, whom I admire very much, who's a friend, but also conservative evangelicals. In fact, Mike is a friend, and I once said more than I realized I was saying. Mike said something wonderful, and I said, Mike, you're really unusual. You are a Christian who behaves like a Christian. And then I said, oh, that's what you think, huh? I think that we forget that a lot of these voters are white, they're older, and they are Southern inflected. They're more Southern than the population as a whole. And so in a lot of ways, they're voting more like older white Southerners than they are like Christians, that they're voting that part of their identity. Now, I think, and that goes all the way back to the Goldwater campaign, where many of these voters or their parents or grandparents shifted from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in reaction to civil rights and have been voting conservative and Republican ever since. And we forget the Democrats were long ago the party of segregation, and that started changing under FDR and Truman, and decisively changed in the Kennedy administration and under Lyndon Johnson. And so Trump didn't really get a whole lot larger percentage of the evangelical vote than Romney did. He got about 3 points more than Romney. I suppose what does surprise us is how do evangelicals manage to vote for somebody like him? And there was a very interesting survey that was done by the Public Religion Research Institute, which asked the question, and I'm going to paraphrase, essentially, does a person's private life influence how he or she behaves, how their performance in public life? And among evangelicals, I think as recently as 2014, 70% basically said you had to have a good personal life to lead a good public life. In 2016, that number fell to 30%. And clearly, they were doing what a lot of us do, which is trying to rationalize a belief to accord with something you had already decided to do, and they had decided to vote for Donald Trump. So there is that racial component. There is, I think, a deep belief on the part of a lot of evangelicals that they're disrespected by others, like by people who teach at places like Harvard. They are, that the values of the country have moved in a direction that they disapprove of, and they sensed a kind of crisis, and they were willing to vote for a strong man, as they put it, even if flawed, to kind of strike back at their enemies. So I think all those things came together to explain evangelical support for Donald Trump. It's worth noting that a lot of evangelicals did not vote for him in the primaries, though a lot did. There were, where there were exit polls, in 19 states, Trump carried the evangelicals in Republican primaries, and Cruz carried them in 8 other states. Trump was actually beaten in Iowa by evangelicals. So it's not a completely straight line story, but when it came to the election, they were ready to vote, and there was an intense dislike of Hillary Clinton in that community. And I happen to like Hillary. I think Hillary Clinton is a very decent, smart person, so I don't share this view, but I think it was a very strong view in that community, and some of that vote was an anti-Clinton vote.
And so where are we with that same group of people in 2018? Has there been a change in 2 years?
The answer is basically no. In fact, for a class today, we were looking at the polling on religion and voting. And this is very preliminary. It was sort of the early exit polling. But it was very interesting. 2 groups did not move at all. And they were, in a sense, the people outside what I might call the religious middle. That white evangelicals voted 22% for Democrats for the House. That's like 2 points more than in 2014, the last midterm. The other group that hardly moved at all were the seculars, people who are not affiliated with religion at all. I think in 2014 they voted 69% Democratic. This time they voted 70% Democratic. All the movement was in Protestants as a whole, moved 5 points. Catholics moved 5 points away, toward the Democrats. Jews actually moved 13 points. They were already high Democratic. They went even higher. and people of other faiths moved about 5 points. So the evangelicals didn't move, the strongly secular didn't move, and that most of the movement toward the Democrats came in these other groups.
You know, I've never really thought about this before. They're not, but there are many more religions now in the United States than
Yes.
just Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. Where are the Buddhists? Do we know?
There's not good polling on Buddhists. I wonder how Buddhists feel about polling, as a matter of fact.
I don't know.
No, it's actually a challenge for pollsters. Some of you know this book. It's an old book by a man called Will Herberg called Catholic Protestant Jew. And it was basically that all Americans assimilated into a kind of civic religion that was Americanism. It was a very interesting argument. It was back in the 50s. If Will Herberg were alive today, he would have to call his book Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim, Confucian, Buddhist, Jain. It would be an astonishing thing. And the country really, its religious landscape really has changed dramatically since Kennedy's election. And Alan and I were talking about this, by the way, something, just a thought to ponder. To me, a lot of the anti-Muslim backlash now is not at all unlike the anti-Catholic backlash of an earlier time. That Catholics were seen as allied with a foreign power. The Vatican was seen as a foreign power. They were seen as allied with a church that was anti-democratic and authoritarian. And before Vatican II, the teachings of the church were not as, in a sense, liberal as they had become. All these things were tossed at Catholic politicians. There's a great story about Al Smith where he was in a meeting and some of his opponents were quoting papal encyclicals against him. And Al Smith, Niebuhr actually tells the story. Al Smith looked at his aides and said, "Would somebody just tell me one thing? What the hell is an encyclical?" said Al Smith. And similarly with Muslims are accused of being authoritarian, being anti-democratic, being allied with foreign powers. So I just think it's something, especially for those of us who are Catholic, but those of us in any minority religion, Mormon has faced an awful lot of prejudice. That what's happening to Muslims now happened to many of us in an earlier generation, many of our people in an earlier generation.
You know, I read this interview you did over at the Harvard Divinity School talking about your course and mentioned that you've been looking at the relationship between politics and religion for a long time. And you said one of the things that strikes you right now is that for a long time we looked at the question as how does religion influence people's politics, but that now with these political divisions so deep that people's politics are actually influencing their religion a great deal. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, I have told both my students at Harvard and Georgetown that, I've been interested in the subject pretty much all my life. I mean, if you grew up in Fall River, church, party, union, it all seemed kind of one thing. But particularly in the last 25, 30 years, I've done a lot of work in this area. And I have had to sort of rethink a lot of what I think in the last 5 or 10 years, because I really did always look at the arrow going from religion to politics. How does your religious faith influence your political views? If you're Catholic, how does Catholic social thought influence your views on poverty? If you're Jewish, how do prophets like Amos, Micah, Isaiah influence your attitudes toward social justice, and so on? If you're African American, the Exodus story is so central to what happens inside African American churches. Now I think that we are so politicized and so partisan that we really kind of backfill, and that it's actually our party that is influencing our view of religion, and our ideology is influencing our view of religion. And you see this when people go church shopping, they are often church shopping for a congregation that is sympathetic to their political outlook. Now, this is not brand new. There's a great line that C.S. Lewis wrote that people turn to Scripture not for enlightenment about politics, they ransack Scripture for support for their own political party, and he wrote that a long time ago. So there is a lot of that, but I think it's disconcerting if you take religion seriously. And this is left and right. I'm not just singling out people I disagree with. I think there's a lot of this going on, and it's something for us to ponder which part of, where is this arrow running, and what does that mean for us morally and philosophically? If I could say one other thing that we've talked a lot about in the class, and this is something else that's changed substantially in the last pretty much 10, 15 years even, that recent, is the rise of what are called the nuns, not the people who taught us, and UNS, whom I revere, but the NONES, the people who are unchurched, who say they're not part of a religious tradition. Among Americans under 30, 40% say they are not affiliated with a religion. Now, people say, well, young people are less religious than older people, but this is hugely different than young people of 1, 2, or 3 generations ago. There's a real secession from organized religion on the part of an awful lot of young people. Some of it is because this young generation is very progressive, and there's an association now, a close association of religion with conservative or right-wing politics. I think some of it is a mistrust of institutions of all kinds. And many of these nuns will say they believe in God and have spiritual lives, but they are religiously disconnected. And that's an extraordinary change in the American religious landscape.
I tell this story. Alan mentioned that I worked for the Globe's website, Crux, for a little less than 2 years because Crux went out of business at the Globe. It's gone on. John Allen, one of the writers there, runs it himself now, but it's not with the Globe anymore, basically because they couldn't sell any ads. The website Catholicism has a tough time selling ads, at least in the Globe it did. But one of the stories I went to cover when I was at the Crux was this get-together of 2 of the 4 horsemen of atheism. I wrote their names down because I knew I'd forget. Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, he's no longer with us. He died a few years ago. But Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett were at this event in, I think it was, what town is Tufts in? Medford? Medford. It was near Tufts. And being a Catholic, you go to a lot of Catholic events, and I feel like I'm young because everybody is, is quite up there in a lot of these Catholic events. I went to this Four Horsemen of the Atheism event. Everybody was 20. The place was absolutely packed. I got there a half hour early. Good thing I did because they sold it out so early, and it was filled with people who wanted to hear a kind of what I thought depressing view of the world, even though he's very funny and he's very smart, Richard Dawkins, but it was kind of a depressing perspective, but they loved it. They loved it. So what is that about?
I knew Christopher for a long time, and I actually found he had
brilliant
cancer.
Brilliant guy.
Yeah, he was brilliant. And I actually found myself in church one Sunday praying for him. And then I looked up and I said, "I'm sorry, Christopher," because here I was. And apparently he was very kind. He gave absolution to anyone who prayed for him, and said he appreciated the sentiment, even if he only saw it as a sentiment. But I think that religious people, in the minds of a lot of the new atheists, are associated with a variety of forms of irrationality. They are seen as anti-science, and that I think critics like Dawkins or Christopher or others will cite lots of things religious people say if they sort of engage in a literal view of Scripture. So they see them as anti-science. They see them as, in a fundamental way, anti-rational. And then they also point to the many crimes that have been committed in the name of religion. Now, if you are sympathetic to religion, I think, you do have to acknowledge that many crimes have been committed in the name of religion, but it is often the case of people invoking religion for secular purposes and using religion in this way, and that there have been regimes, Stalin's Soviet Union comes to mind, that committed a lot of crimes in the name of non-belief. Nonetheless, I think that the very idea of a leap of faith implies that faith is reasonable and connected to reason, but it is something beyond scientific knowledge. And I think the atheists, the staunch atheists, believe that that leap of faith is ultimately irrational. I have to say my personal bias is in favor of humble believers and humble non-believers. And the really hard atheists sometimes offend me in the way certain kinds of very hard believers who are prepared to consign lots of people to hell can offend me as well. And I respect the humble believers and the humble atheists who will acknowledge the imperfection of our perceptions and the limits of our knowledge. The dialogues I find most interesting are between humble believers and humble non-believers, because they can actually talk to each other. Anyway, that's...
So we're in the JFK Library. Tell us about the Catholics and politics, where the Catholics are now, where the Catholics were 2 years ago.
Yeah, well, Catholics always vote for the winner, actually, which is clearly the work of the Holy Spirit, right? No, it's true, though, that for example, in 2014, Catholics voted Republican for Congress. And in 2018, just narrowly, they just made the window this year. According to the exit poll, 50-49, they voted Democratic for Congress. Now, a lot of that is because Catholics are, in their nature, diverse. That about a third of Catholics are Latinos, about 10% of Catholics are African Americans. So the Catholic vote in some ways mirrors the national vote. The other thing that's interesting about Catholics who take the church's teaching very seriously is Catholics are the ultimate cross-pressured voters, because if you look at the church's agenda on social welfare, on health care, on poverty, on the death penalty, on immigrants, often on war and peace, you would say this is a liberal church. If you look at the church's teaching on abortion, contraception, gay marriage, you say this is a conservative church. I always say that the purpose of the Catholic Church in politics is to make everybody feel guilty about something, which proves that I'm a Catholic. I get that. And so Catholics are cross-pressured in this way. And I've looked at this over the years. There's also an enormous regional variation, by the way, in the way Catholics vote. You know, I looked at how I was, when I was looking at a lot of polls one election, and I said, gee, I am a married guy, white, Catholic, church-going, and I looked at the polls and I said, gee, I don't vote like most people like me. And then I looked up me in Massachusetts, and I voted just like people like me in Massachusetts, in DC, where I've also voted, or in Maryland. So there is a regional variation in this. I think that the other big fact about the Catholic Church in politics in America was a sharp swing in the hierarchy during the John Paul and Benedict years to the right. Not necessarily the far right, but that the bishops appointed under John Paul and Benedict tended to be more conservative. If you remember when Cardinal Law and Cardinal O'Connor were named, they were known as Cardinal Law and Order.
Right.
Although Cardinal O'Connor, it should be said, had a very strong pro-labor commitment. Now the bishops that Francis is naming tend to be somewhat more progressive. Supich in Chicago, Tobin in Newark, what's his name? McElroy in San Diego. These are more progressive bishops. But I think the church's public voice became significantly more conservative between, say, 1975 and by the end of John Paul's pontificate, because the church was putting far more emphasis on issues like abortion and less emphasis on the social justice agenda. I think what you have in Francis is somebody, from the point of view of more progressive Catholics, writing that balance, putting more emphasis on the social justice teachings, on poverty. And it'll be very interesting to see what impact that actually has, if any, on Catholics in the pews. And we haven't even talked about the other troubles the church
No, but we're going to get to
faces.
the other troubles in
Yeah,
just a
no,
second.
I'm sort of perfectly happy to avoid them. But yeah,
Well, but I did want to ask you, though, that Democrats put a lot of hope into the growing Latino population in the United States of America, but it doesn't seem to me they always should, because just as there's great diversity among progressive Catholics, between progressive Catholics and conservative Catholics, there seems to be huge diversity between Latino Catholics all over the place.
well, again, just there are a couple of splits. First of all, we use the term Latino, which is sort of like using the term European to refer to Germans, Irish, English, French.
That's a great point.
And that Latinos are from Cuba, and they're from Puerto Rico, they're from Mexico, and they're from Bolivia. They're from Central America, and there is sort of that kind of diversity within the community. Historically, Cuban Americans in Florida were much more conservative because they were very anti-Castro. The younger generation doesn't carry that as much. The big split among Latinos had been between evangelicals and Catholics. About a third of Latinos are evangelical. George W. Bush got somewhere around 40% of the Latino vote in both of his elections, by some measures even a little bit more. And he won about 2/3 of the evangelical Latinos. The Catholic Latinos tend to be, with the exception of Cubans, tend to be more democratic. Mm-hmm. The evangelicals tend to be more conservative in a lot of ways and more Republican. That broke down in the middle of Bush's term. If you remember, Bush was pushing for immigration reform. Bush was very pro-Latino, pro-immigrant. When immigration reform was killed by Bush's own party, there was a real backlash. And although John McCain was actually very pro-immigrant, he suffered a sharp decline from Bush's vote because even the more conservative evangelical Latinos wanted to punish the Republican Party. So what you're talking about now is Latinos as a 75-80% Democratic group in the country. 70-30 is probably a little bit better. I think this does not have to be the case if Republicans were not perceived as being as strongly anti-immigration and in effect as strongly anti-Latino as they are.
So you did write a terrific piece about being a Catholic right after the Philadelphia report, Pennsylvania, I should say, report came out about more abuse. And just tell people what you said, because I think the question of how difficult it is to remain a Catholic gets asked by non-Catholics to Catholics all the time.
You know, when these stories came out, both the Pennsylvania report and Cardinal McCarrick in Washington, whom so many of us respected, he was really quite an extraordinary man in so many ways, and he was one of the last people you would ever expect to get caught up in this. And so there was a kind of double whammy of the details of that were in the Pennsylvania report, and then the McCarrick business. And I thought about this a lot because, in a way, none of this was really surprising. If you read the Boston Globe 25 years ago, as recounted in Spotlight, that extraordinary movie, we knew a lot of this, and yet it hit us again. And so because of my interest in religion, my editors like it when I write about religion, because there aren't that many liberals who write a lot about religion, and it's just something I'm interested in, a lot of readers are interested in. And I've been silent on this when it first broke. I was actually visiting the Post, talking to editors, and one editor said, we really like you to write about this. And I said, I know I can't yet find it in me to do it. And I ran into the editor of the editorial page, and I said, I've been stunned into a kind of angry silence. And he looked at me and said, E.J., silent? And I said, yeah, I guess it's a kind of miracle. But I finally felt I had to say something about this. And what I wrote is, and for Catholics in the audience, you may have experienced this with your friends or families, the question, how can you stay? Loomed in a bigger way than it had for me before. And I and that's what I wrote about, and it was an anger that came of that. And it was, and I say this as somebody who really feels like I have received a lot of gifts from the church, from my, from the nuns who taught me and the Benedictines who taught me, and what I know about social justice and our obligations to others. So much of what I believe actually deeply comes from having been raised Catholic, and the sense of a loving God. There was an agnostic kid in our Catholic school. He was Jewish and agnostic. He was one of my best friends. And he used to win the Christian Doctrine Prize every year. And he always wore a button that said, "A benevolent God is the greatest creation of man." But if you actually have the gift of believing in a loving God, that really changes your view of the world and the universe. So I have these feelings of gratitude toward the church. But there is this anger, and what I decided is, why did I feel this now in a way that even all the other stuff didn't push me to that point? And I think it is because this round reminded us that while the rules changed substantially after the initial scandal and after the Globe stories and the other reports, and there were all those cases in Pennsylvania, there were just 2 of them that came after the rules changed. So something did fundamentally change in the church. But I think this was a reminder that the hierarchy itself had never held itself accountable, and that we really hadn't interrogated hard enough about the internal culture of the church that led to both this kind of behavior, but in worse, a tolerance of it and a refusal to face up to it and to empathize more with the victims and their families than with the interests of the church's public image. And it just hit harder. And I didn't go to Mass for a couple of weeks, and my wife said, I'm the Mass goer in our family, and she said, "You're not ready to leave yet, you should go back." And I have been going back, and I am still thinking about it, but it shook me in a way, and again, there are aspects of the church I'll always admire. He's probably been here, Brian Hare, who is head of
Yes.
Catholic Charities here, and all the charitable work of the church. There's no finer human being, I think, on earth than Brian Hare, and there are so many people like that in the church, and the church does this work. Our sister Carol Keehan, who's just stepping down from the Catholic Health Association, is one of my heroes. And so all those folks are still there, and I don't really want to walk away. And I think a lot of Catholics feel that way, and yet this has been a challenge in a way others weren't. The last thing I'll say is, for those of you who did see Spotlight, the scene that sort of moved me the most, we were talking about this
Yes.
earlier, was when Michael Resendiz, the great Globe reporter, was in a church, I think it was at Christmas time, and it's such a powerful scene because he doesn't say a word. There are no words spoken. And he is in this church, and you can sense from his face, from the scene, that he has this enormous affection for an institution and a faith that he feels has been sort of pulled away from him. And it's a really beautiful scene. And, it's interesting. It is, in a way, not at all an anti-Catholic scene. It is actually a scene that expresses enormous love for this church.
So you mentioned before the nuns, the young people that have no, what does that stand for? No religion?
No, none, just N-O-N-E-S.
Yeah, none.
In polls, when they are asked what religion are you affiliated with, they check.
They say none. Okay.
N-O-N-E.
So what happens to the children and grandchildren of Catholics like you and me, and who tend to be much more liberal on social issues, who've grown up with gay and lesbian friends, who are, if they're women, they've grown up to be, I want to be equal with the guys. They're much more socially liberal. Even young evangelicals are much more socially liberal. So does the American Catholic Church 15, 20, 50 years ago? What do you see?
It's funny.
Did I say 15, 20 years ago? I meant 15, 20, 50 years ahead. Will the American Catholic Church make it
No, I'm worried about that. There's some of you may remember she was on CNN on Crossfire and that sort of show, Kate O'Byrne,
Yes.
who was a wonderful, very conservative woman, very smart, and she and I like to banter a lot. And she's Catholic, and she said, you know, well, I'm not worried because our kids are becoming priests and your kids aren't. And there was some truth to that. And I do think that there have been departures left and right from the Catholic Church. It is not just more liberal young Catholics that have left, but I think the departures are probably disproportionately on the liberal side, and they are disproportionately among women. There's Tom Rees, Father Tom Rees, a great Jesuit, once wrote that we talk all the time about bishops, but bishops don't make Catholics, mothers make Catholics, and we're losing the mothers. And it's pretty powerful. And so I think there is a secession, and I think that, you know, the numbers of Catholics in the country as a whole have been kept up by Latino immigration. Pew did a big study that showed that something like a third of people raised Catholic have left. It's a very substantial number. I think it went from sort of 29% are born Catholic and then 20% are left after that, but then those numbers are augmented by Latinos. So it is a real challenge to the church. And what you have are more liberal Catholics like us, if I may throw you in that.
You can.
Who basically say that if the church doesn't change, they're going to lose all these folks. And more conservative Catholics who say, well, that's all right. That might even be a good thing because we will have a harder, smaller, purer church that will uphold what those conservatives, they would say more Orthodox Catholics, feel is the true faith. And I think that it's a war of visions of the church. Francis, who unfortunately I don't think has handled this scandal as well, does not have that view of the church and seems to have a much more capacious view of the church and does not want a shrunken church. And you know, I am hoping he finds his way through this scandal because I think the vision he has laid out for us is a very attractive vision. And if anybody could win some of those young folks back to Catholicism, it's much more likely to be Francis Catholicism than other forms of Catholicism.
So we've got a few minutes before we're going to take questions. Let's do a little political predicting. Does Donald Trump make it to 2020? And if he does, will he win again?
I think he loses if he makes it to 2020. And I wish I had a spy in Robert Mueller's operation to be able to answer that question. I mean, I'll tell you my own view, which is I don't think Trump should be impeached unless the evidence is so overwhelming that lots of people who are not anti-Trump going in, like me, are persuaded by it. And the reason I think that is I think in the long run, defeating Donald Trump in the election will give a kind of legitimacy to the anti-Trump cause as opposed to turning him into some kind of long-term martyr if he's impeached. I know for some of you it's hard to even think of Donald Trump as a martyr, but for the hardcore, that is how he would look. And so if Mueller does find particularly damning stuff, particularly about the Russian connection, and the news today about his lawyer, Michael Cohen, suggests that he may actually have some more information, Mueller. That's my view. And I think that's the view of the majority of the Democrats in the House, certainly Nancy Pelosi, that you don't rush to impeachment. I don't think that's wise politically, but I also don't think that's wise institutionally. It's almost like we got too used to impeachments recently. But I do think, I really do think he will be defeated unless the Democrats are even more self-defeating than they have been at other moments. I mean, Democrats got 9 million more votes than the Republicans in these House races. That's an enormous shift. I mean, just think about it. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 2.9 million. 2.9 million. This is 9+ million plus Americans. That's a lot of votes to move in 2 years.
Yeah.
And that suggests, I think, where the country's view of Trump is he's never gone over 50%, except in maybe a couple of Rasmussen polls. And he's
Not very
been
reliable,
down
usually.
around 38 to 40% often. This is not a Trumpian country. We're not a majority Trumpian country, so I think he is defeated. And do not ask me which among the 40 Democrats are going to win the nomination.
Why not? We have several from Massachusetts.
I have never been, I had to do this on a show, and they put up a chart, and I said to reflect my views of this race, you'd have to put up a picture of a Rube Goldberg machine. I have never felt so clueless, actually. I've been doing this quite a while now. You could tell by my white hair. And I have never been as clueless as I am now of who, I don't see a dominant candidate in any way.
Well, I talked to you about this upstairs. Some people are talking, apparently there's a committee that's already launched to pressure him. Beto O'Rourke, who people may know, very charismatic young guy. Some people say he looks a little bit like Bobby Kennedy. He's a young man who lost to Ted Cruz in Texas, but he came closer than a lot of people thought he would because Texas is a very red state. Can you possibly run for president? Well, I suppose you can. It's possible. But it does seem odd to me to run for president when you've just lost your bid to become a United States Senator.
Right, and everybody's saying Lincoln did it. And it's probably the most famous case. And then I can imagine, people asking Beto O'Rourke, do you really think you're Abraham Lincoln? That would be fun to be in debates. I think it's possible because Beto O'Rourke has the capacity to raise enormous amounts of money very quickly. Where he raised about $92 million, I think, on his race. A lot of it was in small contributions. He is very charismatic. The Democrats, I think, are not yet excited about anybody, and O'Rourke is very exciting. The one thing I think is that Democrats, and I've had a lot of conversations with very, very progressive Democrats who in other kinds of situations would want to nominate a decidedly left or progressive candidate who this time believe the first task is to defeat Donald Trump, and we can get around to the rest of the stuff later. And I think there's going to be a lot of pragmatism. I think electability, which is not usually, am I losing my, electability is going to be a more important characteristic in this race than it's been in a long time.
So we do have to talk about the hometown team here in Massachusetts. We've got Elizabeth Warren.
Oh, I thought you were going to say the Red Sox, the Patriots, and the Celtics.
No.
Mookie Betts for president.
Mookie Betts. Yeah, that's right. We've got Elizabeth Warren. She's much talked about. Deval Patrick, our former governor, is much talked about. John Kerry, who ran before, obviously, less talked about, but nonetheless talked about, and by a few people, although not many, because he seems to be about to be squashed by Nancy Pelosi, our congressman from the North Shore, Seth Moulton, who's young, but maybe a little tarnished by this race with Pelosi to unseat Pelosi. But are any of those four possibilities?
Remember the Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes? Anybody can enter, anybody can win. I think that they're all plausible. I mean, Elizabeth Warren clearly has a national following. And remember, the last time there were a lot of the Democrats who lined up in the end behind Bernie wanted Elizabeth Warren to run. So I think she does have a built-in support system around the country to start. And it'll be interesting to see the dynamic between her and Bernie. And what does Bernie decide to do? Does he cede to Warren? Does he not cede to Warren? Do they end up splitting much of the same vote in the party? Deval Patrick is, as you all know, is a very attractive figure. He is a wonderful speaker. I think I worry as a Massachusetts person that the country tends not to be kind to candidates from Massachusetts, except the guy whose name is up above us last year. God bless Mike Dukakis. And so I wonder what the party and the country will make of any of the Massachusetts candidates.
One last thing before we go to...
I'm not a self-hating Massachusetts person. I just read election returns. I love Massachusetts.
One more thing before we go to the questions. You wrote a piece a few days back talking about Nancy Pelosi's wizardry. I think a lot of people, including myself, bought the Moulton idea. Well, she's been there forever, new leadership, the three of them, she and Steny Hoyer and Clyburn, they're all in their late 70s.
The collective age is 235.
Yeah, it's
That's
a long
little,
time.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I've been reading nonstop hosannas about her and what she's managed to do as Speaker of the House. And people maybe have seen the magazine cover of the New York Times this Sunday when Nancy Pelosi is there in this red power suit. She's got a pair of heels on that are about 4 inches high. And you may remember, at 78, remember she was lobbying, I think it was about the Dreamers. She talked nonstop for, I believe it was 8 hours, about the Dreamers in those high heels, and she never once went to the bathroom in 8 hours, and she's 78. So the more I've read about her, the more I think she is one tough cookie.
Well, she really is, and everybody should remember she is Nancy D'Alessandro Pelosi, and her dad was mayor of Baltimore. And Nancy Pelosi was the person in the family who kept the card file of favors that were given, that her dad gave out. And she is, a lot of people say she's a San Francisco Democrat. Actually, she's a D'Alessandro Baltimore, old-fashioned kind of Democrat. She'd be very at home in old Boston, I think, Nancy Pelosi. And I think there are a couple other things. One is that if you look at her record, a lot of people argue, I would be one of those, that the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, probably would not have passed if Nancy Pelosi hadn't been Speaker, hadn't pushed for it, hadn't figured out a strategy, hadn't disciplined House Democrats to vote for a Senate bill that they really didn't like very much compared to their own. The House bill was actually better than the Senate bill, but the only way to get it into law was to pass the Senate bill. And I think she pushed President Obama a little bit, too. There's some evidence of that from what we know, to stick with it. Or she bucked him up at a crucial moment. And a lot of stuff happened in that 2-year period. The Dodd-Frank Act passed, the stimulus passed, the Lilly Ledbetter Act passed. I mean, it's a pretty big list of achievements. But the other thing is, who is the alternative? It's very striking, and one of the reasons I think she's been able to put it together is no one was really willing to step in the ring and say, I'll oppose you. And now there's an argument that, well, the people who might have been plausible speakers, you think, for example, of Chris Van Hollen, a very good congressman from Maryland, kind of gave up and decided to run for the Senate. He's now a senator from Maryland. Javier Becerra from California was seen as another plausible candidate. He just gave up. He didn't want to wait, and he's now Attorney General in California. So there wasn't an obvious opponent. But then she's obviously just a very good politician, and you saw immediately Marcia Fudge sort of backed off, changed her mind. Brian Higgins from New York changed his mind. I think the congressman, your congressman from South Boston, Steve Lynch has already signaled, even though he signed the letter, that he might be willing to back off. So I think she makes it. I think the only catch is there were about 9 who gave very, very hard commitments in getting elected that they wouldn't vote for Nancy Pelosi because she doesn't poll well. I mean, in the CNN exit polls, her approval rating was 34%. And so a lot of members who got elected said they wouldn't vote for her as Speaker. And it's funny, I don't know, some of you may remember this, she was speaking at Harvard at the Institute of Politics in October, and somebody asked her what she thought of candidates trying to win by saying they wouldn't vote for Pelosi. And in a very characteristically Pelosi phrase, she said, "Just win it, baby." And she didn't care what they said about her. She just wanted them to win their races. I don't think those 9 can vote for her. It's a public vote. I think they told their voters that. So she's really going to have to pull over, persuade some of the never Pelosis to vote for her so she gets to that 218. I think she will, but I think that's still a hurdle that she's got to get over.
Okay, we got some questions here that we can thank you very much. Thank you very much. Whoops. There goes my microphone. Don't lose the microphone. Okay. I'm going to read the second one because I can read it more easily. You ready? What would your advice be for undergraduates who want to pursue careers that meld religion and politics?
Oh, that's a great
It
question.
is a great question.
It's, by the way, it's very interesting that Gary Hart, the aforementioned Gary Hart, got a degree in both, I think he's got a law degree from Yale and a divinity degree from Yale.
Really?
Yeah, and there's actually a great congressman from North Carolina called David Price who has a Master's of Divinity and a PhD in political science. It's very funny because an opponent went after him. He had a religious right opponent who said my opponent's victory would be, a victory for Satan. And it was really hard because David is this very religious guy who is an elder of his church. And that one didn't play very well at all. I love the fact that somebody asked that question because whenever I teach these courses on religion and politics, I say that, it is commonly said that the two things you don't talk about at the dinner table are religion or politics, and that in our house, that's what we talked about all the time at the dinner table. I don't think there's any natural path. I mean, there are many people, the Catholic Church now does not permit, people who are priests to run for Congress.
Right.
Did
that end with Father Drynan?
Father Drynan, so that one of Pope John Paul's achievements was to make Barney Frank a congressman. Yes, if you it's true. And Barney would say, "I owe my seat to John Paul II." But there are many ministers who went into politics. Obviously, in the African American tradition, there are so many ministers who have been politically active. There are a number of them in Congress. And I guess there is an enormous amount of work done through various kinds of social service work combined with organizing that people have done through religious traditions. So I don't have any particular advice on what to study, although I do think that keeping alive your faith and your knowledge and your kind of wonder, and Abraham Heschel once said that wonder rather than doubt is the root of all knowledge. I've always liked that idea. And that it's very hard. I think the one sort of piece of caution is I do believe the two can go together, but I also believe that politics itself and the compromises are absolutely necessary in small d democratic politics can be very challenging to a person of deep faith. But again, I mean, our growing up, these things were not as far apart as we have come to think of them now.
Here's an interesting one. What can you say about developing political courage in Congress from your view of religion and politics?
Wow. This is an easy crowd. They ask really easy questions. There's a great Bobby Kennedy quote about now is a time for youth, not a time of life, but a state of mind, a preference for adventure over the love of ease, the predominance of courage over timidity. It's a beautiful, it's a beautiful Bobby Kennedy quote. And the older I get, I like the part about not a time of life, but a state of mind about youth.
That's right.
How do we think of courage? I mean, there is a willingness to stand up to your constituents. Courage sometimes is a willingness to stand up to your own side when you have. That's probably the hardest kind of courage right now in politics, is because the pressures within each community. I think I say this a liberal, I think it's even stronger on the right, where to be a dissenter within your own tradition is punished rather severely now, and instantly on the radio, online. What were you going to say?
I was going to mention Jeff Flake, the senator from Arizona, who's not running again. You may all remember during the Kavanaugh hearings, he was accosted by the two women in the elevator. who were very upset with him and said, if you vote for Kavanaugh, you're saying that my sexual assault doesn't matter. And then he went down and held up the vote. But he said that the only reason he could take that position was because he wasn't running for office again.
Right.
And talk about a dearth of political courage when it's just all about re-election,
Right. Well, I think that, and I think all of us have known politicians like this, and we admire them, who clearly have a set of commitments where if they do not live up to those commitments, they won't be able to live with themselves. And that's why they would rather lose than not to be able to live with themselves. And probably the hardest ones, there's probably something in the Screwtape letters about this, are the ones that are grayer, because it's easier to rationalize. If I vote yes on this, it's not the right vote, but I can live another day to fight why. And I think politicians tell themselves this a lot. Sometimes it's right. I think there are moments where a politician gives a little here and gets a lot more when they have the opportunity to fight. But that is an awfully big temptation that if you repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, then you've kind of lost your way. Mario Cuomo, I think, once said that sin gets a little easier every time. And I think there's truth to that. So how do you develop the habit to, if you get into a habit of giving in, but also, I don't know, these days it just takes courage to be in politics at all. It's a pretty vicious time.
Yeah.
And when we see in a way to go back almost to where we began, to see what happens to people's family lives, to see what their children are sometimes made to live through. We're very anti-politician, and in a way that's healthy because Americans mistrust power. But there is something deeply honorable about being willing to take all that flack. That's why I honor our elected official who heads this library. Getting into the arena, the old Teddy Roosevelt line, that itself takes courage. And even if it means making some compromises, being willing to fight in public for something that matters, for something bigger than you, that's courage too.
E.J. Dionne, are you a consultant for the TV show Madam Secretary and the Dr. Henry McCord character? I don't know who asked that.
I wish I were. It would be easier to pay college and law school tuitions.
Okay.
I haven't seen enough of it, but I've enjoyed the Madam Secretary that I have watched.
Yeah, it's a good show.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good show. Tina Leone, isn't it? Is she the person that is the secretary?
On that one, we turn to the on the old show when you turn to the crowd to tell you?
Oh yeah, that's right.
Somebody
is
here
it
knows
Tina
the answer
Leone?
to that.
It is. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Great.
What was that called when they did that? Oh, anyway, never mind.
Oh, the Lifeline.
The Lifeline.
You get lifelines. What show was that? That was a good show. You want to be a millionaire.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
We missed that
We
one.
should try that.
Yeah, we should try that. I think we're too late on that one, EJ. I think it's all done. Any comments on the religious diversity in the new Congress?
I think it's awesome. First of all, there is a natural pattern that is happening that happens with every immigrant group, and it's now finally started to happen with Muslims. I have a Muslim student, who is writing a paper on the number of Muslims who ran for office this time, both people who won and people who lost. I think that they are following a natural progression that immigrant groups followed for a long time. I mean, a long time ago, it was unusual to have an Irish guy in Congress, and then it was unusual to have an Italian in Congress and a Jew in Congress. What you're seeing is, we think a lot about anti-Muslim bigotry in the country, which exists. We think a lot about what happened to the attitudes of a lot of Americans toward Muslims after 9/11. And a lot of people being demonized and tarred because of the actions of a very small number. And yet voters around the country have said no to that. And sort of in every generation, going back again to John F. Kennedy, people finally faced up to this and said, no, this person is not on the ballot primarily a Muslim. They are a fellow American seeking my vote. And so I think it's very exciting that we are seeing that process continue. And that is not, in a way, that's not a revolutionary thing. That is a really old, traditional American thing of new groups working their way into politics and getting their share of power.
You touched a little bit on this before, but we got a couple of these questions about Pope Francis. So I'll take one. How would you describe his leadership? You did kind of touch, but elaborate on that a little bit. Oh, thank you.
You know, even sort of leaders you like or love or admire are often wrong on something. Another, by the way, the great Barney Frank line, who is your political base? The base are the people who are with you when you're wrong.
Yeah.
It's a great way to think about it. And so, on the whole, I think Francis has been a wonderful thing for the church. I think both in the way he lives his life, going into the prison, washing the feet of, at Easter, right at the beginning. There are all kinds of stories. The Swiss guard is, standing outside. Why are you standing? Have a seat. Let me bring you a sandwich. I mean, he has sort of disdained the sort of, living where he lives and not in the papal houses.
Driving the little car.
Yeah, driving, yeah. All these things
driven.
about him and what he has been teaching about poverty and what he has been teaching about the environment. So for someone like me, this is just a wonderful thing, both as, both the kind of person he is and the teaching. I think on the pedophilia scandal, he's had a blind spot. And I think, in fact, Carl O'Malley here has had to push him at moments on this issue, and others in the United States have had to push him on this issue. He's attacked quite brilliantly a culture of clericalism in the church, and yet on this issue, he seems to be affected by it to some degree himself. And and he's not someone we can expect to open up the question of, say, women in the priesthood. That was something that I thought, all right, you can't get everything at once. But I thought since this new round of the scandal, we probably do have to think deeper and more radically about what needs to be done in the future. So I have great respect and great affection and appreciation for him. But I'm really praying that in the next few months he gets this one right, because I think in the end his papacy will be tested by this, even though all these other things he's done are incredibly important.
A few people have asked about different people of different religions becoming the president. Someone asked, can an atheist be the president of the United States?
Well, we don't know if we've had an atheist as president of the United States, do we? I mean, I've thought about that a lot, because there are, we did have a Unitarian. William Howard Taft was a Unitarian. I'm not saying Unitarians are atheists, by the way. Just saying. I have great affection for Unitarians. Although I had a dear Unitarian friend who once said, "Yes, we believe in at most one God." She said, but there was a poll done many years ago that I always thought was kind of fun about us, where there were two agree-disagree questions. One said, I like it when our president has a deep religious faith. That got 70% yes. And then there was another question asking, I don't like it when politicians talk about how religious they are, and that got 50% yes. So there are an awful lot of people who want their president to have a deep religious faith, but really don't want them, the politician, to tell them much about it. And now, I think there's a good sort of instinct there. People don't like people who flaunt their religion in public because they don't trust them and think they are probably pharisaical in some way in their, if I can use that term, that they are sort of showy and therefore they are not as strong in the inside. But I think for a very long time, a lot of Americans associated being religious with having a moral sense and a moral compass. And so when they say they don't want an atheist as president, they are saying, I'm not sure an atheist would have this strong moral compass. I think that's going to change, and I have a feeling, in fact, I'm almost positive, given the trends among young people, that acceptance of an atheist as president will probably go over 50% within 25 years. I think it'll take that long. But again, I think that we actually don't know if we have ever had an atheist president. And
'cause you would
there
not
are
announce
people,
it.
read Lincoln's second inaugural sometime, which I think is one of the greatest documents in American history. Both sides worship the same. It was about the Civil War.
Yeah.
Both sides worship the same God, he didn't answer the prayers of either. And you could read that document and say that Abraham Lincoln has a very, very, very profound faith. And you can also read that document and wonder, is Abraham Lincoln a profound doubter about the Almighty? And I think Lincoln himself struggled with this question all his life. He was fascinated by it. But that is, I think it's one of the most powerful religious documents in American history. Because it's got humility at the heart of it.
Just as a quick aside, I happened to read a few years ago Bearing the Cross, book about Martin Luther King, and came across his kitchen table conversion, where he claimed that he heard the voice of Jesus Christ telling him that I'll be with you always. And it's interesting, you almost never hear that talked about when people talk about Martin Luther King and all he did for civil rights. And I wonder if, because that's the sort of thing you just referred to, that people get nervous when someone talks too much about their faith, because you don't hear that very much about Martin Luther King claiming he heard the voice of Jesus Christ. When Sarah Palin said that God told her to run, she was ridiculed from coast to coast, and yet you have one of the great civil rights leaders of all time writing about this himself and having others write about it in terms of what enabled him. I think he was only 26 or 27. People don't know the story. It's a great story. He's in his kitchen and he's getting death threats, and his first child has just been born, and his wife Coretta and the baby are asleep in the house. And he picked up the phone. It was about midnight, I think, if I'm correct about that. It's late at night anyway. And he's getting another death threat. And he's a nervous wreck because he was rather reluctant. He didn't really want to be in this position. He kind of had this vision of himself as having a more peaceful life as just a minister in a regular church like his father. Anyway, that's when he made himself a cup of coffee. He sits down at the kitchen table and he talks about this moment where he heard the voice of God telling him, you do this and I'll be with you. And that enabled him to get the kind of courage he needed to know that he was probably going to be shot sooner or later. So why is that such an obscure thing? I mean, you know it, I'm sure, but most people don't.
Well, I don't know. I think that Dr. King is sort of deeply known and not deeply known at the same time. And I think we almost like as with many, extremely famous people, people tend to remember the person they want to remember. There are angry moments that King had about our country, some of the things he said about the Vietnam War and what a firm opponent he was. We don't talk about that King much. We tend to talk about the unifying King, and he was that, and he believed in conversion of adversaries, which I think is very important. He found a way to combine militancy with a belief in the conversion of adversaries. But we don't sort of read the King of the letter from Birmingham jail that was really tough on moderates and on compromisers. I'm somebody who kind of believes in incremental politics. If we can get 10% more covered by healthcare, that's good. And then King calls me back a line in his I Have a Dream speech where he talks about the tranquilizing drug of gradualism, which is a kind of critique of all moderates, even moderate progressives. But I thought, bless you for doing what you did with Sarah Palin, because I do believe that when it comes to religion and politics, all of us on all sides are capable of enormous hypocrisy. That when a liberal hears that about Dr. King, we would be inclined to say, yes, that's awesome. This religious moment gave him the courage to face great adversity. And when we hear it about Sarah Palin, people tend to make fun of it and say, how could that possibly be? When people intervene in politics on our side who are religious, we say that's great. They're showing their moral courage. When they intervene on the other side in the name of religion, we start talking about separation of church and state. So I think your comment was really good, because I think we have to check ourselves on this. I think the other thing is we've gotten to a point where people are surprised that anybody who is a liberal can be religious. There's a great story. Tim Kaine, the senator from Virginia, was against the death penalty, although he said he'd enforce it as governor, and his opponent attacked him, and he had this great ad where he said that, I am against the death penalty because my faith teaches me that all life is sacred. And his advisors showed this ad to voters to see how it played before they ran at a focus group. And this should give liberal religious people a start. A bunch of people in the focus group said, oh, that's great, he's religious, he can't be a liberal. And interesting.
Well, speaking about people whose religion would prevent them or make it easier for them to run for president, someone sent something about Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York City, who's Jewish. Would he have a chance? But of course, Bernie Sanders was Jewish.
Right, but he didn't win.
He didn't win. Do you think that there's a terrible rise in anti-Semitism? We've been seeing it a lot. There's been a lot written about, like, terrible incidents even here in Massachusetts with anti-Semitic and swastikas and so forth in high schools. But do you think that Bloomberg's Judaism would hurt him were he to run?
See, what I wonder is, are there anti-Semites? Yes. Would there be anti-Semitism that would come out in some way or other during that campaign? I'm afraid yes. On the other hand, would the voters who would form the majority that would elect Bloomberg be much influenced by that? I think the answer is no. I guess the question is, are there swing voters who might vote for Bloomberg but wouldn't because he's Jewish? I think that number is probably quite small. That the kind of majority he needs to assemble would tend to come from people for whom who are either strenuously opposed to anti-Semitism or are not affected by it. But I think it would not surprise me. I mean, Barack Obama, after all, was called a Muslim, and he's not even a Muslim.
Right.
No one. By the way, I've always said that Obama's religious hero has to be Job. Because, first he is a Muslim, who wasn't born here, and then finally people accept that he's a Christian, and then Jeremiah Wright comes along, and so then everybody says he belongs to a defective stream of Christianity. It's no wonder that he sort of didn't talk about religion as much, because no one, a speech, another, I taught my class this morning, so I sound like I'm being your professor, which I apologize for, but Barack Obama's speech in 2006 to the Call to Renewal conference, if you Google Obama Call to Renewal 2006, is one of the best speeches on religion. And I know a lot of conservative Republicans who didn't vote for Obama who believe this. It's one of the best speeches on religion given by a politician, because he lays out the obligations that religious people, Americans, have to non-religious people and the respect owed them, but also the respect owed to religious people, including religious people we disagree with, owed both by non-religious people and by liberals who are critical of those who are more conservative or orthodox. And it's challenging to everybody in the debate, and I think that's the right kind of speech to give about religion.
We only have a couple of minutes left, but there are a lot of people in the audience, based on these questions, are very concerned about the future of the Catholic Church. You talked about women in the church. You don't see them becoming priests under Pope Francis, but what do you see as the future for women in the church? And what do you see as the future of celibacy in the church?
I actually once wrote a piece after Benedict resigned, I guess. I wrote a piece suggesting that we needed to elect a woman as pope. And I argued that actually there might be a way without a woman becoming a priest that she could become
to the top.
pope. Right? Yeah. Well, let's just start at the top. It is quite possible right under church rules now to make women cardinals. There's no requirement that a cardinal be a priest. And I can think of a number of leading women who could be made cardinals quickly. I personally think the church, I am for ending celibacy, the celibacy requirement, and women in the priesthood, not only because I'm in favor of gender equality, but also because I really think one lesson of the scandal is we need to expand the pool of people who would enter the priesthood. We need a broader group of people at the table, a broader group of candidates for the priesthood. It's interesting. Francis gave in a dialogue with, I think, an evangelical leader, some indications that he is open to ending the celibate priesthood, and they may actually do it in parts of the world where they're running short of priests. I think they're going to run into some real trouble if they say it's okay here but not everywhere else. They already have admitted to the priesthood converts from Anglicanism who are married. So I believe this should happen. I don't think it will, but I think even if you did anytime soon, but I think it would send a powerful message about gender equality if they did take steps like naming women cardinals. And maybe someday they'll elect a women pope, and then we'll see what she does.
Okay, E.J. Dionne, do you have any final words of wisdom here before we say goodnight? Want to wrap this up?
I guess I want to say two things. One is I do love Margery Eagan, and I am really grateful.
Thank you.
I am really grateful to be here. And I guess I just want to say my teaching for this semester is over at Harvard, and I talked about my gratitude to the Catholic Church. I feel enormous gratitude to the state of Massachusetts and to New England and to the kinds of people who show up at a meeting like this. The late Mary McGrory once said that every baby born in Massachusetts is born with a campaign manager's gene. And I got to say that there are always parts of yourself you think are okay and parts of yourself that aren't so good. A lot of my favorite parts of me are from Massachusetts. The deep love of politics I have, what I learned about loyalty, which we Massachusetts people are to a fault, a deep loyalty to the Patriots, the Bruins, the Red Sox, and the Celtics. And I'll just close by saying this, that I love being in a place where A, you don't have to argue about Deflategate, and B, I actually loved Deflategate because I learned the joys of being a Fox News commentator. I didn't care what the facts were. I just knew which side I was on. Thank you all very much.